Okay, I'm going to go through chapters 10 and 11 from Smith today and talk about the connections, especially coming out of the World War II era with Freud and Jung and Lacan, and how they influenced Burke, the way that Marx influenced Burke, and then the way that all of these, especially Burke's new approach to rhetoric, really heavily influenced postmodernism. So, in postmodernism, which we're going to see coming up, our influencers really are the existentialists, modernists, Burke, everything that comes from psychology, and then all of the critical questions that we begin to ask. So let's start at the beginning of this. So we're influencing Burke. Who we really start by talking about is Freud. What we want to keep in mind with Freud is that we're leading into World War II when Freud starts theorizing all of his particular ideas, and he starts to set up with here's how the mind works. So we have the unconscious, the conscious, and the subconscious, the id, the ego, the superego, and the way that those three work and the way that those three interact. While he was specifically focused on psychology, a lot of his ideas are very rhetorically influenced, and so that's why we talk about him. What we're really talking about, especially with how we want each of these energies to interact with each other, and then the result of the interaction is very similar to Aristotle's catharsis. So how do we get the preconscious, the conscious, and the unconscious to interact in a very positive way within culture so that we feel catharsis, we don't feel like there's a problem? And what he starts to theorize then is identification and alienation, which become very, very important to Burke. So we're going to talk about them more with Burke than we are with Freud. The structure of the psyche, the id, the superego, the ego, you guys can read through these notes. These are ontological structures, which means they don't just make knowledge. They're not just ways that we make knowledge, but they're also ways that we make and understand and learn and teach values. So we don't just know something, we know something that's related to a culture, that's related to a specific function, that's related to uses. Nothing is sitting by itself, and Freud was kind of the first ones to think about that, and then we'll see Jung depart from that and take it even further. The next is defense mechanisms. So the way that defense mechanisms are very rhetorical. How do we understand these? How do we try to understand these? How do we react to these particular ideas? We can see how the id, the ego, the superego interact with each other, and then the ways that interaction, so too much ego, too much superego, too much id, lead to feelings of alienation and identification, and speakers play to that. That's how the id, ego, superego powers interacting with each other have a very specific rhetorical function. If I speak to you guys in a certain way, so if I started to dumb down these videos and not assume that you could look at these notes and you could read them as well, you guys might have a feeling of alienation. Why isn't she speaking to us like grad students anymore? Why is she speaking to us like we're 18-year-old freshmen? You notice the difference, and then that's going to influence your performance. So as a speaker, as the person delivering the oration, I have some control over how the id, the ego, the superego interact with each other. I might not do it correctly as the speaker. I might cause problems. That happens, but it's something that when we're speaking happens within our brains. It's something that Freud begins to theorize that then also heavily influences rhetoric, because how does that interaction influence an individual or a group to then do something? And what happens when that group does something? There are times when groups do amazing things, and there are times when groups do very scary things. So how can we understand a lot of this both preemptively and after the fact? The id, the ego, and the superego give us one set of ideas for doing that. So as I said, Jung breaks away from Freud over the idea of the collective unconscious. So while Jung is a student of Freud, he's beginning to theorize this idea that there's a lot more going on, and that culture is much more influential from a much earlier period than we expected. So one of the things that you read for people who are pregnant is that the baby in the woman's stomach can hear voices and can hear sounds and begins to recognize all of those things that are around them. So what I thought was really interesting is then once my son was born, when I went back to the place I'd been working, one of my coworkers that I worked very, very closely with, he immediately recognized her voice from a very, very, very young age. I think he was like 2 weeks old the first time he saw her, because I had worked with her so much and he'd heard her voice so much that he was being influenced by that, and he would turn in her direction, and he's had very specific interactions with her because of that. That's what Jung is seeing, and that's where he's saying, so then what happens? As soon as babies are born, we typically put pink or blue on them immediately, so we genderize them. what happens when we do that, and how does that influence how that person, how that culture begin to make sense of everything else and the way that all of this functions. And then when we develop very specific cultural ideas, how do those circulate and what do we need to do with them? So you can see I have the example of the dark mother. We have a lot of stereotypes about stepmothers and the way that stepmothers function and how we're supposed to interact with them. So what happens to children if their parents become divorced and they now have a stepmother? This is their example. The evil queen is who they see, so then what happens? Those are the kinds of ideas that Jung's dealing with. He obviously doesn't have answers for these. He's just, we need to start discussing how all of these cultural mythologies function and then influence behavior, influence decisions, especially at the subconscious level. So if we look at something massive like Gamergate, part of the critique that a lot of cultural critics have against games is that games don't always have options for females to play. They don't have good options for some of the female characters or good representations for the female characters, or storylines beyond shooting. So what happens if somebody plays a game and that's not a storyline they're comfortable with? Or what happens if they do play that storyline and it reflects them? How do they learn some of those behaviors, learn some of those ideas, and then take them into real life? So Gamergate started because the cultural critics started critiquing games and saying we need to expand the genre, and a couple female game designers did, and there was a backlash from gamers saying those aren't the kinds of games we want, leave our games alone, we're happy and we're having fun playing them. So, the interaction is not really mixing. We're seeing a difference in culture, and we're seeing what happens when two cultures don't come together well. The conversation doesn't happen, and then those game critics, which were all female, eventually had death threats levied against them on Twitter, because obviously that's okay. It's Twitter. It's not real life. It's all make-believe, because I make believe over here in games, so I can make believe here in Twitter, even though it's affecting a real person. We're not drawing all of these connections, and then the more you start to critique, why are gamers who are attempting to prove the worthiness of their genre sending death threats through Twitter and then saying that they're not learning anything from games? There's a huge disconnect here. How do we talk about this? How does this function? What happens with this disconnect in behaviors? That's really what Jung is getting at, is what happens to behaviors, to understanding, to how we make sense of the world, especially at the subconscious level. What is it that we're not noticing? So I told you about the game previously, the PETA game, where they're trying to teach kids why veganism is good, and what they're accidentally teaching kids is that protesting, hugging strangers are both good things, and that sexism is absolutely okay. Women can't fight for themselves, only male Pokemon. Most parents do not want their kids to not learn stranger danger. Stranger danger is really important, so we don't want our kids hugging other, random strangers. Children protest enough. The last thing I want is for my 3.5-year-old to go on strike even further. And I certainly don't want him to think that boys are better than girls or girls are better than boys. Equality, come on. So these at the subconscious level could have very specific implications that the game designers for the PETA game, they were going for, anti-capitalism and veganism, and they didn't realize that they were accidentally teaching kids these. So even at the subconscious level, the designers designed in ideologies and cultural understandings, archetypes that they had no idea that they were designing. So now what's going to happen to the kids who play that? That's what Jung wants to know. So when he breaks off from Freud, that's where he's going. And so Jung's much more rhetorical, and he's very important for rhetoric, especially for Burke, for that reason. What does culture do to rhetoric? So Aristotle cared about making knowledge, and the Greek and the Roman rhetoricians cared about making knowledge, but culture was fairly stagnant for them. The only people with power were white middle-class males. Now we're hitting a time period where women are going into the workforce because most of the men are in Europe fighting World War II. So what happens to the women who have gone into the workforce? What happens to the women who have been left behind? What happens to the men who have been left behind? Gender roles are no longer the same. The middle class is no longer the same. We do not have one stagnant culture. So now what? Great questions. This is what Jung's going for, and this is the direction that rhetoric's headed. Jung then obviously influences Lacan, who is very, very rhetorical, and he's looking at the connections between the actual conscious and the potential consciousness. So what do we understand actively, and what do we understand subconsciously? How do those two things interact, and what do we do rhetorically to activate the one that we want? So if we activate potential consciousness, we're going to subconsciously understand and make sense of, we might internalize better, or we might get a group especially in education, to internalize better when there's active reflection. So how do I get you to consider how to think about thinking and then the direction that I want you to head with that particular thinking? And how do I do that through the language that I'm speaking and the act that I'm putting forth? Marx then asks all of the false consciousness questions, and he develops this whole approach to critical theory. So these particular critical questions begin to influence the pentad that Burke designs, and then they ultimately influence Foucault, especially with the postmodernists, but most of the postmodern questions that we ask in relation to power. So Marx theorizes that we have the bourgeois, who's the controlling class, and then we have the proletariat, who's the working class. And he says we need to educate the proletariat to ask critical questions, and then he lists a lot of questions, and you can see them here on the slides. Once we start asking those questions, we can understand what we, the proletariat, what the false consciousness is, so we can overturn the bourgeois, and then we can move life forward. When we read Freire, and I think Freire is in module 4, we're going to see the same thing in relation to education, like almost these exact same questions in relation to education. So when we teach the poor working class very specific middle class values, what happens when the middle class values that we reinforce in school don't match their home system? So if there are lots and lots and lots of statistics in there. I circulate them all the time to you guys on Twitter. So when we say that a lot of the students are a part of the free lunch program or a part of the free breakfast program, and part of the problem is that's an indicator that schooling might not be as reinforced or as supported at home, what happens to that student? Even as teachers, when we try not to prejudge that student, we start to prejudge that student as a C student. So if you go through K-12 as a C student, what's your likelihood of going to college? What kinds of jobs are open to you if you're a high school graduate versus what's open to you as a college graduate? And then how does that influence the amount of power that you have in the world? And that's what Marx wants to know. These are the really important questions that Marx asking. He always wants the proletariat to overthrow. And for the most part, that particular approach and that particular equality has not always worked well. Communism in practice has not been very successful. But for our purposes in rhetoric, what we care about are these critical questions. What questions can we ask as part of dialectical materialism to get to a synthesis? So if we have the thesis, the antithesis, and then we want to come to a synthesis, the goal of these questions is to determine the synthesis that's going to most positively affect the proletariat. Which one is going to be the most important? So we'll just go through a couple of these. Who is allowed to speak and who isn't? This is a matter of who has access, who has power, who has the ability, who has the time, who has the money. It's very expensive to run for an elected position. So who is capable of doing that? What kind of background do you need to set yourself up for that? What kinds of friends do you need to have? What kinds of connections do you need to have? That all plays into the who is allowed to speak. So it's not just who we're letting speak, but it's legitimately who has the access, who controls the power, who can afford to, who controls the means. All of these are really critical questions to understand. How does the bourgeois interact with the proletariat, and how does culture influence how those particular classes remain those particular classes? If we bring Jung into this and we bring Lacan into this, then at a conscious and subconscious level, how does our understanding and our being in culture consciously and subconsciously influence how we make decisions to either reinforce, or in Marx's case, how do we draw up a synthesis that will, instead of reinforcing, will incite to strike, or to, Marx always says, wake up the citizens, to incite the proletariat to do something because now they understand it. But we need to understand all of these questions as culturally situated to make any kind of a difference. So that's where Burke picks up. So Habermas approaches the public sphere, and he separates the public sphere, and then most theorists who use Habermas say the public sphere and the private sphere. So the problem with the public sphere, for the most part, is that it's in its attempt to be rational and to be progressive, because of its approach to rationality, it's very exclusionary. So it becomes white, rich, middle class, again, accidentally. I really don't think that Habermas's intention was to be as exclusionary as he was, but when you start setting all of these very specific rational principles, the level of education required to have that kind of a rational discussions, the bar is starting to be raised. So to join the public sphere, the conversation needs to be higher. And for the most part, it's leaving out a lot of women because women didn't, especially in Habermas's time, so the 1940s to 1960s, didn't participate in the public sphere as significantly as women do today. So the public sphere is the space for creating mutual understanding. If the players in that particular space state their presuppositions instead of inferring them or implying them, we're all actually talking about them. The truth conditions are established, the expression reveals our intention, the speech is performed in a way that precludes deception, we're informed by consensus, we all come to this mutual agreement on how we're going to discuss a very specific issue. Habermas's public sphere theory is then rationality can rule the direction of the conversation. It can be more effective, it can be more productive, and society can be better. So the goal is to progress that society forward with an understanding that rhetoric influences the political public sphere, and if we treat the public sphere in a very specific way, it'll be a much more positive benefit. The problem is this is incredibly boring. And like I said, it's very, very exclusionary. It's very hard to get people to sit down and decide on these particular rules. I think most congressional officials would agree that, yes, this is how Congress functions. It is a place for critical, rational discussion. But at the same time, there are loopholes designed into all of the rules. We'll see people who don't cast votes for specific reasons or cast them in very specific ways. So it becomes, how does all of this come together, and then what is it that we do with this? So Habermas is really good at separating the spheres, but he's also heavily critiqued because he separates the spheres to the point where they become very exclusionary, especially against women, which is one of the largest feminist critiques of Habermas. Okay, next we have Burke, who is kind of the father of modern rhetoric. Rhetoric in communication departments relies on Burke a little bit more heavily than English does, but even English really likes the Burkean approach to modern rhetoric and the way that Burke influenced postmodern rhetoric in very specific ways. So the first thing that most people learn is the idea of the Burkean parlor. So the way that the Burkean parlor is situated is if you started the video right now, so this exact moment, we're a few minutes into the video, you wouldn't stop it and immediately send me a question, why didn't you cover Marx? You would go back and watch the video. You would wait and see what I talk about in the future for these next couple of minutes. You would gauge the discussion in the room to kind of understand and contextualize the information that you should know before you join the conversation. That's the Burkean parlor, and that's kind of the underlying theory behind everything Burke does, is everything is culturally situated, whether it's consciously or subconsciously done, so we're constantly figuring out how are we situated, and then what do we do? What should our act look like because we're culturally situated? So we want to account for culture in specific ways. We want to gauge the conversation in specific ways to understand, okay, now where do I go? So Burke theorizes rhetoric then as dramatism. So everything is a performance, everything is an act. We don't have one solid identity, we have an identification in different situations. So rhetoric becomes symbolic inducement that tries to move others in desired direction through the manipulation of symbols, language, pictures, images, television, moving images, you name it, it fits in there. So as symbol users, we manipulate symbols when we talk to each other. I use my hands in very specific ways. I don't know how not to. And that becomes a way of communicating information to you guys. It's a part of my symbol. It's a part of my identity. You guys would be very confused if I had a video where I didn't use my hands because you've come to know me in this space in those very specific ways. So now your understanding of my identification is a mismatch, so you get confused. So now you've stopped paying attention to everything that I'm saying because you're focused on my hands instead. So I've used language to get you to focus somewhere that wasn't language, it wasn't theory. I manipulated symbols, and now you guys look at my hands. I should do like a magic trick or something, right? So this is Burke's whole point. Everything is an act, and it's an act for a specific purpose. My magic trick example during these videos, yes, a little bit random, and there are much more subtle ways that we use these symbols in very specific situations to then help exemplify our meaning and to help get our point across and to help induce our audiences to do something. And that's where Burke starts. So he says, okay, how do we understand this? He has a lot of different theories. You guys can read through this. He asks a lot of questions, drawing very heavily from Marx. How do we pull Marx's questions and make them more rhetorical? They're both in the book and here in the notes, so you guys can look through those. I just wanted to go over the pentad really, really quickly. So when we're dealing with the pentad, what we have is, and you guys can see my cursor in the video, we have the actor, the action, the scene, the agency, and the purpose. And then each of these have very specific rhetorical functions. They're all outlined here. And then the goal is to understand the relationship between different points on the pentad. So the actor and the action have very specific interactions. The actor and the scene have specific interactions. Actor and agency, again, specific interactions. Actor and purpose. What we're attempting to determine when we use these frame analyses and when we use ratio analysis is which connection is the most powerful in this particular setting. And when we notice that that's powerful, what is it that stands out? So I'm still using my hands and I'm using the mouse. Very specific actions are standing out in this part of the video. Is it because I talked about how my hands were distracting you from listening to theory? Are you now listening to theory more? So again, I'm manipulating symbols in specific ways through an action, through a part on the pentad between actor and action. So my ratio analysis is popping up something that's really, really important for this particular section. That's what ratio analysis is trying to get at. How do these different points on the pentad interact? Which interaction between which 2 points is the most dominant in a given act, and what is popping out as dominant, and what does that mean? How do we culturally situate that? How do we understand that? So again, Burke's not trying to get into the head of the speaker. Why did they make that particular choice? What we're trying to understand is for the audience, for the situation, for the context, for the given speech act, for the content of the speech act, how can we best understand why this particular ratio is popping out, and then what it does, what it induces audience members to possibly do, what it unconsciously and consciously argues for, and how we think the audience might understand that, and why that's important. Why that's important becomes really important to Burke. Burke also talks about identification and alienation, so he's drawing specifically on Freud and how do we identify, how do we alienate, and what is the purpose of this. So if we mix Freud, Lacan's approaches to identification and alienation in with Burke's approaches to identification and alienation, we bring back that original political function of rhetoric. So rhetoric is to, especially from a Cicero standpoint, we want to educate the civic man, and part of civic life is acting in politics, not necessarily being a politician, but engaging in voting, engaging in listening, engaging in participating. So every time a politician puts together a commercial, they put together a website, they put together some view of themselves in some sort of a format that lots of American voters have access to it, what they're attempting to do is to show a version of themselves, a political version of themselves that they think the most number or the largest percentage of Americans will identify with. And the more you get Americans to identify with you, so with your views, with your ideas, with who you are as a person, with what you look like as a person, with how you act as a person, with how all of your background says that you're going to be the best candidate for whatever position, then you'll get the most votes. People will symbolically understand, and they'll be induced to go and vote. They'll be induced to action because they've identified with you, with your ideas, with your party, with your platform, with something. So identification and alienation are normally the easiest to understand in relation to politics because all political platforms do this. They attempt to get the largest percentage of Americans to identify, and as soon as you start identifying, that means you're alienated from the other party, and this is part of the reason that America's been very good about keeping a two-party system. What we saw with the Tea Party a few years ago is the Tea Party actually took votes away from conservatives and from Republicans because it split that party. So instead of a party coming in the middle, taking away votes from both sides, so far, for the most part, we've seen third parties take away votes from one side specifically, so it's alienating individuals within one party, which is very, very problematic for that particular party because then they're weaker, they have less power, they have less information. So we want identification to stick with one of the two parties, and then you'll be alienated from the other party, and both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, always want their party to be the largest in identification because that should translate then into votes. Because identification and the purpose of identification because rhetoric always has a purpose from Burke forward, is to induce people to vote. So if we want people to vote, now I'm using my presidential hand movements, if we want people to vote, we need them to not just identify with us, not just to say I'm a Democrat or to say I'm a Republican, but I'm a Democrat who cares and votes. I'm a Republican who cares and votes. So identification and the rhetoric surrounding all of our communication acts, because all of our communications are now acts, they're dramas, needs to be formatted in a specific way, so pentad, so that the goal is people go and vote. I don't just want you to know who I am, but I want you to know who I am and care enough to do something about it. That's identification. And you'll do something in my side, which means you absolutely can't vote for the other side too, and that's really, really important. So identification and alienation from a Burkean perspective, drawing very heavily on Freud, but they have a more rhetorical function. And for us, especially, thinking of Cicero's civic man and the ties back to politics, they have a very specific political function in American politics. The last thing, and Smith covers this very, very quickly, is the idea of redefinition and deterministic screens. So deterministic screens become Burke's reading, basically, of Jung's collective unconscious. So what aspects of culture do we use, and how do we use those particular aspects of culture to understand or to make sense of what we think a situation, or how we think we should understand a situation, a context, and then what we should do because we understand it in that specific way. And then depending on what our goal is, we're trying to either maintain definitions, or we're trying to redefine words, redefine concepts, redefine major ideas in very specific ways, a lot of which come back to identification and alienation, so that we can get people to identify in very specific ways, so we can get understanding to move in a very specific direction. So if we look at kind of the political tide of the approval of gay marriage, it came down to a redefinition. So we redefined what marriage meant, but we couldn't just redefine the word. Webster's dictionary only holds so much power, and from a rhetorical standpoint, it holds very, very, very little power. What we care about instead is a redefinition culturally. How do we get a large percentage of the American population to redefine this very complex concept in a new way, and then all of the rights that are awarded or afforded because of that redefinition. And then once we've redefined, how do we get the American public to start their deterministic screen from this new point forward in all given situations, instead of reverting back to original definitions and negating all of the progress that we've made. It doesn't always have to be progress, but something's always moving in a very specific direction with deterministic screens and redefinition. And so that's the goal with these particular rhetorical concepts, is how do we understand those cultural ties and those cultural uses and those cultural understandings, because a lot of it comes down to large theory ideas, to very specific words, to concepts that we use in everyday life, and then how we get people to understand our particular use. If you guys have any questions about all of this theory that we covered, feel free to send me a tweet. You can direct message me, or you can always email me. I'll see you guys online.